All right. Well, the next story we have here is about that old Russiagate scam, and it is this one titled "From the Grade Zone" by Alexander Rubinstein. The hacker and the hack. UK government reports undermines star of Cambridge Analytica Russiagate scandal. So, remind us, Will, what Cambridge Analytica is, and then why this scandal fell apart.
Yeah, sure. So, Cambridge Analytica was this like British data firm that generated all this controversy after the 2016 presidential race here in the United States, where people accused them of accessing data that they got through Facebook improperly or unethically to sway the election for Trump, to sort of use this like targeting data for voter demographics. And it's also been tied in with the whole Russiagate thing and all these allegations that the Russian government was involved in this or that they used some of that data. So it's just one piece of that wider conspiracy theory. So this data firm, Cambridge Analytica, they worked with academics at Cambridge University, and they created this app that plugged into Facebook, like one of those things where you can log in directly through Facebook instead of creating like a new account on whatever site or app it is. And their app that they made was basically just a personality quiz that would ask, Facebook users questions, but it would also harvest their data that's like automatically handed over when people use that Facebook login feature, which again, the thing that allows them to sign in directly through the Facebook app. And then that data they were getting, it included things like people's name, their gender, location, education, political leanings, like religious views, basic kind of data like that.
I'm
But they would
just
also get data.
curious, Will,
Oh,
if
go
you
ahead.
know like the specific personality test, or if it's like one of these like see which Game of Thrones character you are, see which SpongeBob character, like that, those kind of things, or was it like a more like 'cause they have all kinds of crazy like personality tests, like you occasionally see like people taking like the how autistic test are you, or all kinds of. So I was just wondering if you had any insight on that.
I'm not totally sure. I didn't. The app was called "This Is Your Digital Life," and I didn't actually see like an example of what the survey was. Like, I'm not sure how goofy it was. I got the idea it was more like one of those psychology quizzes that you take that tells you like what your personality type is, like whether you're an INTJ or I don't know if it was using that exact like that system of measuring, but I got the idea it was something more like psychology than like are you a fan of this show or whatever. Um, but nonetheless, they were using these surveys to gather up all this personal information, and some of it I understand they were actually getting through the survey itself. But I believe it was also the data they were harvesting. That when people logged in to this survey app, it was the data they were harvesting from their Facebook profile. That was the real like data that they wanted, and that was all the stuff I just mentioned, all the location stuff, their education, that stuff. But it would also access their friends' data as well, and so they ended up getting data on like tens of millions of different people. And at some point, Facebook changed their rules to make it to where they're not allowed to do that anymore. But nonetheless, this company, like while they were allowed to do that, gathered tons and tons of data on like tens of millions of people. So that is basically how it worked. Cambridge Analytica used Facebook to grab all this data on people and voters, and they would sell it to corporate clients and governments and political campaigns to help them target their ads and their messaging and stuff. So this company, though, Cambridge Analytica, they actually worked with Ted Cruz's 2016 presidential campaign before they were ever associated with Trump. And there was at the time some reporting on how they were getting and using this data. But it was only after they went to Trump that we started hearing about how this is such a big scandal and how it's like, tied to this evil Russian conspiracy to throw the election for Trump. Obviously, when they were reporting on it in the case of Cruz, the Russiagate thing hadn't really started yet, so they weren't tying it into that. But after it was related to Trump, then they started, it became this gigantic scandal. And people often refer to what happened at Facebook as a leak or a data breach, and they suggest there was something like illegal about what Cambridge Analytica or Facebook did. But the UK government actually just did this investigation where they concluded last month, and they did not find that any crimes were committed, nor any data breach. Like Cambridge Analytica was using the tools and methods that all kinds of other data companies use. And as far as I understand, they were mostly doing it through the legitimate channels on Facebook. Like Facebook had set this up for data companies to use this stuff. I think they did violate Facebook's terms in one way because they had one guy collecting the data through this app and then handing it over to the company. And there's some rule about transferring it from one party to another, but I think they could have got around that without that much trouble. But nonetheless, the UK government did ultimately fine Facebook for just their practices of exposing data to what they said was serious risk of harm. Because they just allowed companies to kind of access it without getting much consent. But nonetheless, Cambridge Analytica was not like involved in hacking this data. It wasn't a breach and it wasn't a leak. So those are some common misunderstandings. But I think we can get into now like what Alex wrote about. But I'll let you jump in before I proceed.
No, I mean, I think you really covered all the important points there. Well, and that was a very thorough reminder because this has been a long developing story. But, I guess Cambridge Analytica played a pretty central role in the Russiagate scandal. I mean, I don't know, maybe if this particular like temple of Russiagate got debunked, it wouldn't have killed the whole story. But it
Right.
definitely would have been a major, major blow. And unfortunately, we really only get this coming out just days before the new election. And now with the election of Joe Biden, I mean, I think a lot of the truth here is likely going to get lost unless Trump does something pretty desperate at the end. So it's great that we have this reporting now, but it's just another failure of the mainstream media to do their job with Russiagate. But tell us what Alex reported.
Sure. I mean, and that is exactly what he did right about just the absolute failure of the mainstream media to cover the story properly. So Rubenstein wrote about the UK investigation that I just mentioned that looked into the Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, and how it just completely failed to substantiate any of the crap that was claimed about Russia and Russian involvement in all this. And Alex also focuses on one particular journalist who's made some of the biggest claims about all this and like touted it the hardest. This Guardian reporter, Carol Cadwalader. Um, and Cadwalader sourced a lot of her stories from this former employee at Cambridge Analytica, Christopher Wiley, who she has presented as like being a whistleblower. If people are watching the YouTube version of the show, they'll see the guy with pink hair. That's Wiley. He's very like eccentric and gay, and like presents himself as being, at the center of this big conspiracy to get Donald Trump elected with this psychological warfare operation. He's very dramatic in how he presents all this, and Cadwalader makes him seem like he's a whistleblower because he says that while he worked there, that they hired quote known Russian agents and Russian hackers to help Trump, and that they did all this unethical stuff with the data and illegal stuff with the data. Um, However, ironically about this Wiley guy, he went on to start his own data company after he left Cambridge Analytica. And I think he left before this became a big scandal. And he started his own company. He was apparently offering the exact same kind of services, the things that he was saying were so unethical, but he was offering those same services to some of the same clients. Like he even met with the Trump campaign before they announced that he was running. And so it's just kind of funny given how critical this guy has been later that like he ran his own company that he tried to do some of the same things. There's also been some dispute about like how high up this guy was at Cambridge Analytica, this main supposed whistleblower. This journalist, Cadwalader, presents him as like the co-founder of the company, but they say that he was only an intern who worked there for like 2 days a week. So if that's true, that alone would throw a lot of his story into question. However, the main thing here is this big 2-year investigation was done by the UK's what they call the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, and that just ended in October, and it was like the biggest investigation of its kind that the ICO has ever done. And they found nothing to support any of Wiley's claims. There's no ties to the Kremlin, no ties to the Internet Research Agency. And they also found that Cambridge Analytica's tools weren't even all that effective or cutting edge, that like all these big claims about their capabilities were mostly hype. And that is actually consistent too with what the guy who developed the app for Cambridge Analytica, this guy Alexander Kogan, he's acknowledged that like the app wasn't all that useful and that the data that it produced would not be that useful for a campaign. And he said that because Facebook's own ad system was so good, is so effective that like he thinks it's unlikely that Trump would have even used any of this data. And to date, there is actually no proof or evidence that his campaign did. There are claims that he used it, but like when pressed, the people alleging this can't actually provide any evidence. So ultimately, I think it is perfectly fine to question like these practices, whether like it's ethical for Facebook to gather all this data and hand it out to third parties. But all the claims about Cambridge Analytica and Russia in the 2016 election have been pretty much debunked, and particularly by this UK government investigation. They found nothing to support any of this stuff, and they said that a lot of what's claimed about their tools was hype. They weren't doing anything unprecedented. There was no psychological warfare operation. It is what like thousands of data firms and ad firms do on a daily basis. And not to mention, it's also effectively what Barack Obama did when he ran. He heavily relied on the same kind of data mining and like micro-targeting tactics that they're accusing Trump of here. So it's one of those things where there's a hell of a lot of smoke, but it doesn't seem like there's really much fire.
I mean, I would even question how much smoke there is after that breakdown. Well, I mean, that was fantastic. And again, it's just another one of those Russiagate stories that is now essentially bunk. I mean, I'm not sure
Yeah.
what else, they would even have with the whole Russiagate narrative to claim here. other than just their paranoid delusion that WikiLeaks worked with Russia to get the emails and then put them out in coordination with the Trump campaign, which they could prove absolutely none of. So, Will, anything else on this story, or?
That's pretty much it. Like, Alex gets into how this reporter Cadwallader, she also tried to tie this all into Brexit and accuse them of that, but that stuff also is completely fallen apart. So there's, like, pretty like her claims have fallen apart on many different counts now.
Yeah, I mean that's another part of this here is that it's not just they're arguing that Russia is influencing American elections, but they've argued that Russia has tried to influence elections, specifically the Brexit one, but elections across Europe and stuff like that. And so
Yeah.
this completely false narrative has developed into a really crazy, like, full blown dementia for people who see Russia behind every rock and apparently ballot too. Unless we're talking about the 2020 election, then we can't speculate on any ballots being not from
That's right.
their initial source. All right, well,